We have to be clear. A changing climate means that weather-related disasters like droughts, wildfires, storms, floods are potentially going to be costlier and they're going to be harsher.
President Obama in drought-ridden California Friday proposing a $1 billion fund to research and help communities deal with the effects of climate change. And we're back now with the panel. Well, the president's case may seem a bit hard to make when the eastern half of the country is in the grips of a brutal winter, but as you heard the president say, climate change accounts for everything from drought to floods. George, do you buy it?
No, and neither does science. But I'm one of those who are called deniers. And the imputation is that I deny climate change. It would be impossible to state with greater precision the opposite of my view, which is that of course the climate is changing. It's always changing. That's what gave us the medieval warm period. That's what gave us, subsequent to that for centuries, the Little Ice Age. Of course it's changing. When a politician on a subject implicating science, hard science, economic science, social science, says the debate is over, you may be sure of two things. The debate is raging and he's losing it. So I think, frankly, as a policy question, Chris, Holman Jenkins, Kim's colleague at the Wall Street Journal, put it perfectly. The only question is, how much money are we going to spend and how much wealth are we going to forego creating in order to have zero discernible effect on the environment?
Climate change, I think it's fair to say, used to be a very hot topic, no pun intended. In fact, it used to be called global warming. Now, not so much. Kirsten, what happened?
I don't know, but it has become very much an article of faith on the left that this is perhaps the biggest threat that the world faces right now. And I think that what Obama is doing is a sort of overtly political move here, because there's no way on earth he's going to get $1 billion out of this Congress to do anything, let alone fight climate change. I would say that the fund is focused on reducing carbon emissions, which, whether you believe in climate change or not, I think is something that people should be able to get behind. I mean, less pollution is definitely a good thing. So that might be a better way to make the argument, rather than claiming that climate change is the cause of every single thing that happens with the weather.
Now, as Kirsten pointed out, that this proposal for this climate resilience fund, $1 billion, is going to be part of the president's new budget, which he proposes in March, and I think most people would agree has almost no chance of passage. Kim, I want to ask you about your paper, the Wall Street Journal. They did a poll of 15 pressing issues. Yes. What do we need to address? Climate change came in dead last of all of those issues. And some Californians say the lack of water in the Central Valley, near Fresno, where the president was, is obviously they have had a drought, but it's because of state and federal regulations that have kept them from sharing water from the Sacramento Valley because of an endangered species of fish.
Yes, and this is a government-exacerbated drought, as it were, because there is water there. There's plenty of water there, certainly enough water to be providing aid to the farmers who desperately need it at the moment. But as you said, they've been keeping it so that they can flush it down to help endangered smelt. So, and what we've had is Republicans have been desperately trying to address this in the Congress with legislation. Democrats, even California Democrats, have blocked that move, and the White House has been against it. So what you've had is Democratic politicians putting the fish ahead of the farmers. And so it's doubly sort of interesting to see the president and then go out there and talk about throwing $1 billion at a problem that could be sorted out much more efficiently with some change in regulations.
Charles, your thoughts about climate change, about the hold it had on a lot of people in the country, particularly around the time of Al Gore and An Inconvenient Truth, and the fact that in the Wall Street Journal poll, when people are asked to rate various issues, it's now dead last.
Well, I once heard the former President Bush say this is a rich man's issue. And I think there was a certain amount of wisdom in that, in this sense. If your other economic problems are in abeyance, if you've got jobs, if you've got income, you've got everything else, you can worry about the long-term threats, if that's what they are, like climate change. And by the way, this is not unrelated to the situation in China and India, where the emissions are growing most rapidly and where the world's carbon emissions are coming from. those are developing countries who are prioritizing growth, jobs, and income over the environment. And in fact, it's the same all over the world as that poll showed in the United States. If we had a better economy, I think people would have more of a luxury to worry about climate change. The exception, of course, being the Democratic Party donor base out in California, which is the people the president was really addressing with this talk about climate change out there.
You know, I want to pick up on Chuck's point here, George, because whatever the U.S. does, you've got these booming, polluting economies in China and India and Indonesia, and the U.S. is just a fraction, what, 4 or 5% of the world's population. How much does it matter what the U.S. does in terms of global climate change if you've got carbon emissions run amok in much of the rest of the world and economies and populations that are much bigger?
And carbon emissions here coming down in part because of the increased reliance on natural gas. Look, Kyoto, Mexico City, Rio, Copenhagen, the climate conferences are a movable feast with a huge carbon footprint, by the way, as they all fly around to talk to one another. Next, they'll go, I guess, to Paris, where they'll get 190 nations around a table. The table will be approximately the size of Belgium, I suppose, at which they'll vote that the United States should give everybody else lots of money, at which point, as happened with Kyoto, the Senate will vote something 95-0 saying, we don't think so, and we'll go on to the next movable feast.
And Kirsten, you know, it also feeds into the Keystone Pipeline, where it's been delayed for years because of the fact that the impact of the pipeline on the aquifer in Nebraska. But on the other hand, if we don't build the pipeline, all of those oil products are going to end up being shipped to China, where they're going to be used with much less environmental regulation. I mean, it's not like if we don't use it, it doesn't get used.
Well, not only that, we will continue to consume oil. If we're going to consume oil, we may as well be getting it from our own country. Environmental degradation, if they believe that's environmental degradation, is environmental degradation, regardless of where you're doing it. So if you're going to consume that oil, why is it okay to just offload that onto another country? That doesn't really make any sense.
So Kim, what's going to happen to the climate change / global warming movement? And maybe you know, because I don't. When did global warming become climate change? When?
It became climate change when you couldn't prove that there was much global warming anymore, you know, as the temperature didn't change. So suddenly we had to have this catch-all term that was responsible. I mean, it meant that any change in the weather somehow supported the theory. But this is a political issue for the president. This is why he's put forward this fund. Remember, the only thing he did not manage to push through from his first term agenda was a legislative cap and trade program in Congress. And his left has not forgotten it. And so they are putting pressure. He doesn't want to do it. It would be deadly politically for his Democrats in Congress. And so he's going to put forward things like executive orders and funds in order.
20 seconds.
Well, I just want to conclude on an optimistic note, which is that economic development in the developing world actually is part of the solution to climate change. Just look at Japan in the 60s, a terrible environmental polluter because of all the heavy industries and so forth. When it made a transition to higher development, became a cleaner nation.
Thank you, panel. See you next week.